Today's episode is sponsored by Future State Media, experts in off-Amazon traffic for Amazon sellers. Future State Media will build you a custom-made website to deliver sales for you on Amazon. Built to grab traffic from search engines and social media, your site can be used as a secret weapon for launching products on Amazon or just to stabilize your Amazon sales. It means you can also build an email list on autopilot. Go to futurestatemedia.com for your free guide to Google SEO for Amazon sellers today. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show. I'm talking to Alex Oxford of TaxValet, and as you'd expect, we're talking about tax, sales tax in the USA. Not a sexy subject, but I think what's really important that Alex has already shed a lot of light on some complex topics and simplified it. We're just talking about this, the fact that, of course, there are always nuances. So you should, if you have any kind of doubt, you really should consult a professional. And people always say that for legal reasons. But I think also, actually, from the business point of view, let me just say that most of us never spend enough time talking to our accountants, and sales tax or whether that be any kind of tax is something we should probably all address, even if it's just to confirm that what we suspected was okay, that our strategy is about right, because guessing and knowing are very different things. So Alex, welcome back. Let's talk about that lovely tax subject, sales tax nexus. Let's dig into exactly how we determine whether your business has sales tax nexus, because that's obviously one of the things that is the start of everything else. First of all, what does even mean? What does the word nexus mean?
So nexus is just a legal term. It means that you have a sufficient presence in a state and therefore have a sales tax collection and remittance responsibility. Don't get confused if someone says nexus or anything else in the sales tax space. What they're just trying to say is that you have to collect and remit sales tax. And there's a whole bunch of different ways you can have nexus, which we'll be diving into.
Well, okay, that tees up my next question, which is how do we find out if we got tax nexus? What causes it?
So it's a loaded question, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can have sales tax nexus in a state, but in general, the easiest ways for Amazon sellers and e-commerce sellers is going to be through economic nexus and through physical presence. And I suppose if you're working with online affiliates as well, then there's a potential for you to have nexus through the affiliates. This is complicated stuff, right? So if you have employees and contractors, you're renting property, leasing property, if you have multiple businesses in the United States, there's all of these other factors that could come into play. And if that applies to you, just know that you should probably get some help with this. But the most common ways to have Nexus in the United States for online businesses is going to be physical presence and economic nexus. Now, you might say physical presence, I'm based in the UK, I don't have a physical presence in the United States, and that might be true unless you are selling on Amazon FBA. If all of your inventory is being stored in those fulfillment by Amazon warehouses, that's creating a physical presence in the state because your inventory is being stored there. And we've seen a number of Amazon FBA warehouses audited by the states and then going after these businesses for not collecting and remitting sales tax. I just had a prospective client meet with me yesterday because Wisconsin's audited the Amazon FBA warehouses. So physical presence. And then the second way is through economic nexus. So economic nexus means that you've crossed certain sales or transaction thresholds and therefore have a sales tax collection responsibility. The states vary in what their thresholds are. The most common threshold is $100,000 in sales or 200 transactions. The states vary in what they define as a sale. Some states only look at taxable sales, some states look at taxable and non-taxable, some look at only retail sales, some look at retail and wholesale. So there's a bit of nuance in doing this analysis can be kind of time consuming and make you go crazy for sure.
So, sounds relatively straightforward, but these are not in and of themselves presumably reliable numbers, 100,000 and 200 transactions. I guess they're kind of warning flags that if you're hitting around the $100,000 revenue in a particular state or 200 transactions, then you should at least be investigating. One practical question, which may or not be in your remit, but how on earth do we find out if I'm based in the UK, as I am in London, and I have a bunch of inventory around Amazon and how do I figure out the
where
tax
your
nexus
inventory is
by
being stored.
state? Well, yeah, it's not even just that because I mean, I guess, well, let me just think through a practical example, right? So I guess in theory this is probably
Hmm.
simple, but I'm just thinking it through
Uh-huh.
practically. Let's say I ship a bunch of stuff in and it lands in LAX because a lot of people, land
Hmm.
stuff in Port of LA
Hmm.
or LA airports if you're air freighting,
Hmm.
and then it gets shipped off to, say, Southern California, and then maybe it
Hmm.
goes to Texas. A lot of stuff goes there because it's big, and then say
Hmm.
some stuff goes to Pennsylvania because that fulfills the East Coast stuff. And let's say let's keep it as simple as that. I've got three different warehouses, two different
Sure.
states. What do I do next? What's next?
Well, that's the larger problem here, though, is the fact that Amazon's going to keep moving your inventory. So even for this example, for 3 states, your inventory could be moved all over. And we had a client of ours who had this relationship with Amazon to where he was only shipping to one state. He was just shipping it to a California warehouse, and that they redistributed his inventory across 40 different states. And he got audited by one of them. He said, "What the heck? I was just sending it to one state. Why am I being audited?" And then that's when he realized that Amazon was moving the inventory around for him. But yes, going back to your simple example, if the inventory is redistributed to 3 different warehouses, and if uh, that would mean that you have Nexus in those 3 states, and we're going to ignore other factors like marketplace facilitator laws, for example, which we talked in our last episode about. Um, but if your inventory is being stored in those states, you have a physical presence, and therefore it would need to get a sales tax permit and then begin collecting and remitting sales tax in those states.
Okay, so thank you for that. So you need to get a sales tax permit, collect and remit sales tax. All right. So we've already talked about the marketplace facilitator laws, which means approximately, if I understand what you're saying, half of the states have decided that they're going to make Amazon or eBay or whatever directly responsible for collecting and remitting the sales tax.
That's
So
right.
just remind me, if you were in a marketplace facilitator state, does that mean and again, I may be asking the same questions asked in the last episode, but I think we need to drill into the and hammer home the basics. If I'm in a marketplace facilitator state, does that mean that I don't need to get any certification? I don't need to do anything. I just simply let Amazon do it. What do I need to do?
So generally speaking, you will not have sales tax liabilities, and you don't really have to worry about getting a permit in a marketplace facilitator state. But that's not the full story, and there's a lot of complexity and nuance to this. I don't know if we want to rehash. I think if you are interested in the nuances of marketplace facilitator laws, you should check out the last episode that we recorded. But in general, if you're selling on a marketplace, um, you don't have much to worry about in the marketplace facilitator states.
So let's assume then, I mean, recently I had an issue with some inventory in the States and I needed to get a bin check done. And it turned out that, as you said, of course, they spread it across. I think they'd spread my inventory and it was only a few hundred units of something. I'm like 400 units left at the point where I had the issue come up. And maybe it was more than that, a few hundred, it wasn't like tens of thousands, but they were across 13 different states, or at least 13 different
Yeah.
warehouses, mostly different states. Let's assume 13 different states. So, presumably the physical nexus thing we've dealt with, but how do we deal with economic nexus in different states? Because it's quite easy on Amazon to figure out which warehouses your inventory is stored in. I say easy, you have to dig around in Seller Central. Actually, it's not
Yeah.
very
Inventory
pleasant, but
detail
yeah.
report. Hmm.
Yeah, so inventory detailed report there. So that's straightforward. But how do I figure out about the sales thresholds in terms of revenue or unit sales by state? Because I don't remember last time I checked into this in detail that the Seller Central really showed that in any detail.
No, they don't show it, and they don't make it easy, because when you're doing that transaction export, you can't look at a full year and export the transactions that way. So it's kind of time consuming and difficult to do the analysis yourself. There are some tools out there that can help you. I mean, we have a spreadsheet on our website that has those thresholds and links to the laws and explanations for each of the laws, um, for the economic nexus laws. Um, we also provide this service for Amazon businesses where we'll go through and analyze the sales state by state, and relatively cheap. And if you end up becoming a client of ours, the analysis fee counts towards your first invoice, so it's free. But it can be challenging and time consuming to get this information, look at the states, making sure you're calculating it correctly, making sure you're taking into account wholesale or marketplace sales or retail sales. Each state defines it a little bit differently. Um, so it is a challenge. I wish there is an easy answer.
Okay, so broadly speaking, it sounds like the most practical approach is to use a third party of some kind to do the analysis for you, um, because it's difficult to figure it out. And can you do that? How does that work practically? You have an API that links to the back end of Amazon and then to a software as a service type thing, or can you do it manually?
Yeah, Yeah, so we work with a variety of tools. So for our Nexus analysis, we're looking at multiple factors for the business, right? We're looking at all of your transactions for the last 12 months from Amazon. We'll go in and pull those from Amazon. We're looking at where your inventory is being stored by Amazon. And then we're hitting all of these other areas that sometimes businesses forget about, like working with affiliates, or if you own other businesses, or if you have contractors. We're just hitting every single point to make sure that you have a proper understanding of where you have sales tax nexus.
Cool. So sounds like doing it yourself is a bit tricky. If you are going to try and do it yourself, then is there particular places to look on Seller Central to figure out where you've sold X units or Y revenue in particular states?
What I would do is I would pull the transactions. I think you would have to do multiple exports because they only let you look at a certain time frame. But I would pull the transactions out and then do some Excel work, right? And do a pivot table, and then that way you can see the count of transactions and the dollar values state by state. TaxJar also makes a tool that can help you with this, but it might be a little bit overwhelming for particularly international businesses that don't know, how everything works in the U.S. Um, those would be my suggestions.
For that, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, some people really want to do DIY, and some people just kind of outsource. So there are two ways of doing it. I mean, I guess if you're based in the States and you understand it and you have a good accountant and mind you, they'd have to be a really seriously good accountant to really get their head around sales tax. I think it's a very specialist
Uh-huh.
area. So,
Uh-huh.
okay, so I think that deals more or less with economic nexus and the physical presence. Are the other things we talked about affiliates, and obviously it depends on your business model. If you have your own web store, presumably you're much more likely to have affiliates. I mean, what do you find that comes up with affiliates, employees, contractors, renting, leasing property? Do you find that's a practical issue most of the time, or is that really quite specialist?
For sure. No, it comes up all the time, and I get these questions all the time from our clients. Like, I had no idea that all these things could have an impact, and once they realize the things that they're doing create sales tax nexus, they actually reconsider. I mean, visiting trade shows to market your products can create sales tax nexus. Having multiple businesses that are selling same or similar product lines, your sales tax nexus can cross contaminate. Working with affiliates, generally just working with an affiliate won't create too much of a problem. However, if you have a substantial affiliate program and affiliates are a substantial share of your revenue, then it could create sales tax nexus in a bunch of states. Um, so there are very real implications, and the issue here is if you cross that threshold, right? Let's take inventory for example. The state doesn't care if you have 1 unit or 1,000 units. The state is just trying to determine if they can come after you for it. And so there's not a whole lot of gray area. We had a client of ours saying, I'm not going to register because I only have 3 units of inventory in there right now. I might have more inventory later on. I said, yeah, but your liabilities are massive. He's like, well, I'll fight it because I only have a little bit of inventory. And it did become a problem and he lost. And all I can really say is, I tried to warn you. So, um,
So you
yeah,
should have listened to your tax advisor. I
yeah.
mean,
Listen to your tax advisor.
yeah, yeah. So basically, if I understand, that's a really important point. There's a very, very big difference between economic nexus, which is based on unit sales or revenue numbers, so some kind of threshold, versus physical presence, which is you've got 1 unit in the state, you should register, assuming it's not a marketplace facilitated state
Yeah,
and stuff, you should
yep,
register for sales tax straight away. Okay, very,
Exactly.
very interesting. So there's like a stark
Same
difference
with
there.
it. Same with employees, right?
Okay.
Contractors in many states,
Hmm.
owning, renting property. There's a whole bunch of things. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. Okay, so there's quite a sharp difference in the way that physical nexus and economic nexus work in sort of practical terms, really. So, okay, that's very interesting. Let's move on to then the getting permits bit. What are the implications for international businesses then? Let's say that I'm, based in the UK or for that matter Germany or wherever. And one question is, does it make any difference where you're based? And that's one question I should deal with.
So doesn't make a difference. I think the states would like to say it doesn't make a difference. So when it comes to the actual processing of the permit application, it's not like they're going to be looking at you substantially different and saying, "Oh, he's from the UK, deny his permit." Not at all. The states love to process permit applications, and they'd love to have you on their roster so they can take your money, right? But there is a difference with the process. There's two large differences. So the first being it can be very difficult to actually submit the permit paperwork, the permit registration to the state if you don't have what's referred to as an ITIN, an International Taxpayer Identification Number. An ITIN is like what we refer to in the United States as a social security number, but it's for international businesses, or sorry, international people, parties, business owners. So you would still need to get an FEIN, which is at the business level. And whether or not you want or decide to get an ITIN is not a topic that we'll dive into here, but I will tell you that there are certain states where it's actually extremely difficult to get a sales tax permit if you don't have an ITIN. And we're talking like we've had to send our employees into the Department of Revenue. This is Arizona in particular, in order to open up the accounts. Um, what you'll find if you're trying to do these sales tax permit registrations yourself is online systems won't work for you if you're an international business because you can't put in your address correctly, you can't put in your phone number correctly, you can't put in your credit card address correctly for them to charge the $10 for the permit. So there's lots of little things that can mess you up, and if you are stuck with that, you have a few options. um, Shameless plug, you can hire us, we'll do the sales tax permit registrations for you. The second is that many of these states will have a paper application, and you can fill out the paper application and generally get to the point that you need to in order to actually get your permit processed correctly. So start with the paper applications if you're outside of the US. So that's the first implication, right? It's like it's a little bit more challenging just because the online systems don't work well. The second doesn't have to do so much with the permit, but what you do after you get the permit. Because after you get your sales tax permit, you're now responsible for collecting and paying the sales tax, right? The issue is when you are preparing the sales tax returns, many of these states, their online systems, when you want to pay the sales tax, they won't take a credit card, they'll only take a bank account, and they'll only take a US bank account. And this is where it is a huge pain, a huge issue for international businesses. If you don't have a US bank account, all the money's being wired to your UK bank account, you can't pay the tax anymore. So we actually just got done cleaning up a huge project for an Amazon seller based in Poland. And she thought she was doing the right thing. She struggled to open up permits in about 20 states. She was telling me what a nightmare that was not having an ITIN. I was like, yep. And then all the states started coming after her because she wasn't paying the tax. She wanted to pay the tax. She had the money to pay the tax, but it was in a non-US foreign bank account and it wouldn't transfer. So generally speaking, in order to open up a US bank account, you need to have an ITIN, that ITIN, that ITIN that we were just talking about, that makes it so much easier uh, to get a sales tax permit. You're going to need that to open up a US bank account. And typically, you need to actually visit the United States in order to open up a US bank account. However, we do have a banking partner we've been working with to open up bank accounts for sales tax purposes without you having to actually travel here, which you would think it would be a whole lot easier to open up a bank account so that you can pay sales tax. You'd think the states would make it easier and they would just have a McDonald's window that you can just drive by and throw the cash in and drive off. But no, it's always got to be difficult. So if you are struggling with opening a US bank account for the purposes of sales tax or other reasons, reach out to me, Alex at thetaxvalet.com, and I can get you connected with our partners who can help.
Excellent. Well, yeah, once again, it makes you think that Europe is actually quite slick on a lot of things. I mean, I know that
Hmm.
Americans come to London sometimes. Well, a lot of Americans come to London. They look a bit sort of amazed when you just wave your card at something. It goes beep, and you just paid. That they're kind of still amazed by contactless. They're
It's like
like,
magic.
guys, like, where have you been for the last 10 years? You know, so there's some. You know, we all always tend to think of the states as being on the cutting edge of technology, and in a lot of ways, of course, it is. They pioneered the internet as such, and also e-commerce. But having said that, the banking system seems to be somewhere so about in the last century. So yeah,
Yeah,
I can believe you. If somebody said that about UK, I'd say nah, they're just talking rubbish. It's not. It's easy. So it's in some ways it's a lot easier for me to just simply pay my assistant in the Philippines, for example, who I pay today in Filipino pesos
totally.
using TransferWise, a piece of cake, than somebody in the States who happens to say the
Yeah,
same language,
huge.
but there's
Yeah,
no ease of transaction going on there at all.
I wanted to, yeah, that's a great point about TransferWise too. I just wanted to bring this up. Many people think that they can use a TransferWise account because they have a quote unquote bank account and routing number. They think they have a US bank account and routing number. That bank account and routing number won't work for sales tax purposes. So there's a couple of these services out there. TransferWise is a really popular one. It won't work for sales tax. I promise you. We've tried. We really, really
What
wish it
about
did.
things like Payoneer, World First?
Nope.
No.
Nope.
What's the other
Exactly.
ones? Currencies Direct? Because
Uh,
they're often used to collect payments from Amazon. So payments Amazon will
yeah.
remit dollars to one of those guys, and then
Yeah.
you transfer it to US dollar account held in the UK,
Yeah.
for example.
So Payoneer, so like Payoneer also doesn't work, and I would
Yeah.
imagine these other ones don't. So you need
Okay.
like a bona fide bank account, which is ridiculous. It's
Yeah.
just the way it is.
Yeah, it's the American states. Well, I guess it makes sense because they're too small to be, run like serious countries. Because well, they're not countries; they're states, but they're not just local. It's something that Brits probably have their trouble getting their head around. Australians, obviously, and Germans, two other federal countries that spring to mind, will have more less of a problem because they have their own parliament for each one, and they're used to the
Hmm.
idea. In Britain, it's just like an alien concept. There's a local council that can raise council tax on you, and that's about it. And then there's a national government, and that's it. So it really it's got to get your head around it. Okay, so moving on then. So assuming that you've got a TIN, which I believe, by the way, you can get online. I've just discovered recently. I wanted to get one for a random reason, just to go in an Amazon Associates account, the Amazon affiliate account
Yep.
in the US. It discovered, oh, I've got to get a TIN, which is for an individual, right? The EIN number is for the business itself. I have to
Correct.
say, I didn't find getting an EIN number particularly difficult. The
EIN's
TIN
easy.
number I haven't really. Is TIN harder? It's something I haven't bothered to look into yet. I was assuming that I just need to
Yeah.
make a few
Yes.
calls.
So the EIN is real simple. It takes like a few more days for international businesses, but it's easy. And it's really cheap if you want to use an online service. I think they'll charge like $100 to get it for you. The ITIN, the TIN, is a lot more challenging. Uh, it takes about 3 to 4 months, and it's
Oh
just a
wow.
waiting game. It takes a while. So we work with a partner who only does TINs for international businesses. It's the only thing that they do. They do nothing else, and they do it really well. Um, and so we can put you in contact with them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's really sobering because I was assuming because I haven't got round to doing that, but obviously I got an EIN number which is per company and got that back in the day in 2014 when I was importing stuff from China for the first time into the US, and it was no big deal. So I was assuming TIN was that simple, but of course, turns out it isn't. So that's very interesting. I mean, I guess the EIN is for the whole of the United States, right? Is that
That's right.
correct? Whereas the TIN is per state, individual state.
No,
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 it's
Tane
also for the
is
US.
still at the
It's the
federal
federal
level, but
level.
it can be used. It can be used at for these state permits, and it can
Okay.
also be used to open up a bank account. It
Okay.
can be used for a whole bunch. It can be used for your federal taxes. Think of it, well, I want to say think of it like a social security number, but many of your international businesses won't really know what that is in the United States. But it's like instead of having a social security number, you'd have an ITIN as
Yeah,
an international
In
person.
Britain we have well, UK we have the national insurance number, which is I think broadly speaking similar. I mean, obviously they work in
Hmm.
quite different ways. I mean, healthcare,
Yeah,
is a mystery to Brits. I mean, we don't understand the American system. It's just it's a different world. But
me neither.
yeah, okay. So thank you for flagging that up. So the apparently little job of getting a TIN sounds like it's a big hairy deal. How quickly
Yes.
do your guys do it out of interest? Because 3 or 4 months sounds like a massive delay.
I think they get it done in like 2 or 3, but it
Okay.
varies. There can be things that come up, and
Hmm.
it's a whole process.
Okay. I mean, that has been my experience. I have to say that again. People talk about bureaucracy in Europe, and yeah, look, if you're dealing with Germany, yeah, they're famously bureaucratic. But apart from that, I mean, Britain, we had. We'll see what happens with Brexit. It reminds me once again that if you live in the UK, that you should take advantage of the company laws here. And you can set up a company for literally £13, about £20. It takes about 40 minutes of online filling. Maybe it's an hour and a half first time you do it, and it's done within 4 hours. You've got a company. It's pretty simple. And importing here, you got to pay VAT, which is horrible, but it's pretty straightforward. I mean, it always amazes me how much of a big
A
deal
lot
that other
simpler.
countries make of these things. But so we must to put it on its head. If you're based in the UK, do not assume that everywhere else in the world offers as fluent a service as that. You may think HMRC, which is Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, are horrible, but you ain't seen
Uh-huh.
nothing yet until you've dealt with the US authorities. So tell me a bit about ongoing filings then. So it's a little bit hard to register. It's a lot harder to pay them, which is weird, but seems to be true. So how do we
Yep.
go with once we've dealt with getting a TIN and and we're able to pay them? We've got a US bank account, so we get the TIN,
Yep.
which is
So you're
individual
all set
person.
up. Yep.
We've got a bank account. We're all set up. What do we do next?
Uh, you've got to do your returns, right? You've got to submit your sales tax returns to the state. So when you get your sales tax permit, they're going to issue you a filing frequency. So it could be monthly, quarterly, or annually, and this is how frequently you need to submit a sales tax return to the state. So if it's quarterly, you do it every quarter, annually, once a year. You get the idea. So let's say you're monthly, you need to submit a sales tax return to the state and make the payment, which sounds pretty easy. In some of the states, it's really, really easy and it'll take you 5 minutes to do. Certain states, the sales tax return, if you're doing it yourself by hand, could take you hours and hours. Like Texas, for example, you have to break down all of your sales based on the locality. You've got to break it down based on the city, the county, the district, the special district, um, all of these different levels. And so it becomes very challenging for you to do it by hand. It also gets very challenging for you to do it without using software or without using a service provider like us, right, who actually just takes care of everything for you. So my advice would be if you're planning on doing it yourself, if you have the guts to do that as an international business, because it's already so complicated, definitely use some sort of software. There's a number of providers out there: Sovos, TaxJar, Avalara, Vertex, Taxify. TaxJar would probably be the best bet for Amazon sellers if you're going to do it yourself, which I wouldn't recommend. Um, if you're not looking to do it yourself, then finding someone in the United States who works with sales tax in every single state in the US and who specializes in e-commerce businesses would be great. And that's exactly what we do. We specialize in sales tax for e-commerce businesses in the US and outside the US.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Okay. So when you say outside the US, you mean for people who are based outside the US but paying sales tax within the
Correct.
US
And
system? Okay. Yeah.
correct.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. And e-commerce, yeah, because it's quite the crossover of two complex systems, e-commerce and sales tax. But famously, the relationship between them is still being shaken out. It's quite clear that
Exactly.
the legal, when the law generally runs quite a lot behind reality, so that the reality of e-commerce growing like crazy has finally come to the attention of the lawmakers, and they've actually got something done about it.
Yeah.
So 2 decades after it's really started, I mean,
Yeah.
Jeff Bezos saw this opportunity in what 1992. Quite crazy to think how
Totally.
visionary that was. But
Yeah.
okay, yeah, and it does make sense to use a specialist because most accountants don't deal very well with e-commerce. In my experience, I've got an accountant who's got her head around it, partly because she took some training, took some of the training I did in e-commerce, and partly because he's based in the UK and so am I. So at least they've got that in common, even if e-commerce is a big push. But e-commerce plus sales tax, I agree that in my experience, you need to find quite specialist people. So yeah, whoever you use, that makes sense. So tell me about the actual. So that's the return side, which sounds like a real mental hernia in some states. What about the actual tax payment and collection? How does that work?
Pretty easy. The payment is pretty easy, assuming you have the bank account, right? Generally, the payment will be made at the time you're submitting the sales tax return, so there shouldn't be too much drama there. The tax collection, once you set it up, as long as nothing changes, you'll be fine. There's so much nuance and complexity to setting up the tax settings based on the channel. You really need to do your research and make sure that you're setting it up correctly, just making sure you're setting up Amazon or Shopify or whatever sales channels you're on. The unfortunate reality is, you mentioned a second ago that the laws haven't caught up to the technology, and that's definitely true. But also, in some respect, the technology hasn't caught up with the laws either. So many of these sales channels are very limited in how sophisticated they are and what they allow you to do with collecting sales tax. And sometimes you just have to do the very best you can to collect the right amount, to collect the correct amount from your customers. So as long as you set everything up correctly, you should be ready to rock and roll. There's a number of issues that will crop up over time though, particularly around when you are listing new products, and especially if you're using a listing tool, for example. When you're listing products on Amazon or on your website, if you're using a third-party listing tool, oftentimes it can mess up the sales tax settings. It can override your account level defaults and you won't even realize it. And if you are just launching 300 new SKUs and then 3 months later you realize you haven't been collecting tax on them and you've been paying tax out of pocket, you're going to have a bad day. So just being very mindful of your listing process and making sure that in your checklist you have sales taxes, a sales tax review on the product level as part of your process.
Makes a lot of sense. So yeah, first of all, just baking it into your processes. Secondly, recognizing, I guess, that it is not yet baked into the processes either of the actual marketplaces, although it sounds like Amazon's got a handle on it. But I'll ask you that in a sec. But it's not necessarily baked into the standard software either, so we have to take special care to check that. So coming back to
Exactly.
that I just left that hanging. Is it the case that Amazon has basically got it nailed down in terms of the process?
So, well, when it comes to tax calculation and collection, they have it basically nailed down. And there are tools inside of your Seller Central that make it really easy for you to collect the sales tax and then just say, you know, which states, city, county, city, district, what's your permit number, and it's pretty straightforward. They give you flexibility around if you want to charge tax on shipping and gift wrap, and I don't know why they even give you that flexibility because the law is the law, right? But they have it pretty baked. We have seen isolated instances in Arizona and Florida where certain districts they're collecting the incorrect amount of tax. It's relatively small, but we're perfectionists here. And so we just kept doing this analysis and we're like, every single one of our clients is off in Arizona. We go to Amazon, we go to Arizona, we say, here's what Arizona is saying, here's what Amazon's doing, and we have like verifiable proof that they aren't collecting it correctly. And I mean, we're talking they're off by a couple percentage points, so we're not talking a whole lot of money. Do they have it fully baked? Um, I give them an A. but they don't get an A plus plus. That makes sense. But
Okay,
it's
for
it's
practical
hard. Sales
purposes.
tax is challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like for practical purposes they got it right. And to be fair as well,
Yeah.
if you try to be A plus plus, if you wait a month, then a state's going to change its mind about the definition of
Totally.
sales tax nexus or whether they're going to be marketplace facilitator
Totally.
or so. Yeah, it's kind of not worth their while to get it 100%. If it's like 97%
Totally.
right, then I think it's probably makes sense. So I'm
Yeah.
going to skip over the question of what happens if you get your own web store because I almost feel like that's going to be a
Yeah.
separate episode. We could get you back to talk about that, but sticking with the Amazon thing for the moment, there's a whole argument that sort of I have to put to you, which is
Uh-huh.
that other sales tax experts who also have, like yourself, very deep knowledge of the area, say you're just making it easier for the states to chase you. You shouldn't register for any sales tax, which sounds like a crazy statement after everything you said, but it's out there, and they're not just crazy people saying it either. So, what's your response to that?
So there is some truth to it being easier for the states to find you, right? Because if you don't have a permit, if you are not registered with any local government at all, it's more difficult for them to find you to audit you because they'd have to audit an FBA warehouse or they'd have to audit a vendor or someone else. They'd have to somehow find your business for you to even come up. And don't get me wrong, Amazon FBA warehouses, for example, are audited all of the time. Like it's just a regular routine thing, and that's how they find Amazon sellers that are not complying with U.S. sales tax laws. Um, However, I'm not comfortable saying, don't get a permit because then it just makes it easier for the states to find you. Because if you have substantial sales tax liabilities and those are accruing and growing larger and larger over time, wouldn't you rather be on the radar and take the chance of potentially having a random audit, and if you're taking care of sales tax correctly, you don't have a whole lot to worry about, than the alternative, which is ignoring it for 10 years, getting audited by a state, and having $100,000 in back sales tax liabilities? I mean, that's the reality of one of the clients that we're working with right now. They've been ignoring it since they started the business, and every year it's been more difficult for them to rip off that band-aid. And now they're at the point where they have to, and you can't really negotiate. So there is truth to that statement, but I would say you always need to temper that advice with looking at what your exposure is and how large your risk is. So I
I,
wouldn't go out right away if you're just now getting started and getting registered in all of the states. That
yeah.
wouldn't be a smart idea.
No, no, absolutely. But for those who are doing substantial turnover, I mean, it's a very again, it comes down to what we were saying in the last episode, which is the calculated risk thing that you need to really calculate it, but you need to really be aware of what risk you're taking if you're going to take it. And I
Hmm.
guess that's it does become quite substantial. And would you say this is another thing that I've heard from people that is less of a risk if you're an international seller than if you're US based? Uh, what's your view on that, if you have any?
If you are selling in Amazon FBA warehouses, I wouldn't say that your risk is lower. If you're using Amazon FBA warehouses, your risk is probably about the same as a US business. And when I say risk, I'm not talking dollar values. I'm talking about the chance of you being audited. If we look at overall, the number of businesses that get audited, the number of businesses are going to be skewed towards uh, U.S. companies just because there's more of them. Now, as for the rates, I mean, I don't have a clinical research project on, I don't have data on this per se, but knowing what will commonly trigger an audit for e-commerce businesses, um, you're going to be about the same if you're storing it in FBA inventory.
I guess that it's hard to get around the fact that FBA concentrates a lot of things, including customers and the likelihood of
Yeah,
making more money from a single SKU, but it also concentrates risk of being discovered by tax authorities should you be trying to not be, because
totally.
obviously there are what 30 FCs, something like that in the US. I can't remember, but it's not an infinite
More than
number.
that,
There's maybe
quite a
more
few.
50. Yeah, it's quite a lot, but they're not an infinite number, and they're absolutely massive. And Amazon's politically, obviously, very sensitive thing. So if Amazon isn't offering your state to put its Amazon's HQ2. That's been decided now anyway, isn't it? They sort of held that out as a carrot. Um, to try and stop states really with going too far with sales tax, I feel. But now they've done that. I guess politically there's a lot of pressure from the mom and pop businesses and the people who dislike Amazon, which is always going to be quite a substantial number
Totally.
to push for it. So it's kind of an obvious target. They've got a big X painted on them, and they're going to be hit. So I guess the chances of your inventory being audited in any given year in a given Amazon warehouse are probably not small, right?
Well, I definitely don't like to scare people. I wouldn't say that they're small. I also wouldn't say it's not small. Um, I don't have data specific to Amazon FBA inventory, but I can tell you that in general, businesses get audited by state 1 to 3% of the time, right?
Okay.
And so this is limited data, and this is a research study that I did, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago at this point. So who knows how that's changed. But I don't want to paint the picture that if you're selling on Amazon, you're using FBA warehouses, you're going to be audited tomorrow. That's not the message I'm sending. If you're selling over 10 years, right, we're looking at chronic systemic problems. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen 10 years from now. It's
Mm.
likely it will happen at some point if you are an established seller and you're selling consistently over a long period of time. You just don't want to forget about it, right? And that's one of our big messages here at TaxValet is don't forget about sales tax. Be strategic about your decisions and make sure you have that annual check-in and you know what your liabilities are in the states where you're not collecting. Because if you're going to ignore the problem, just be smart about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just thinking this is probably very, very dodgy statistics. So I was just trying to do a very quick calculation on my calculator that if there's a 3% probability per year of an audit, then over 10 years that I make that around about a 27, 28% probability. So a quarter
Right.
to a third of the chance. So which is
Yeah.
quite a big if your liability is going to end up being 100,000,
And if
that's a
it's,
hell of a gamble.
yeah,
Like a 1 in 4 chance of getting $100,000 tax bill.
and it could be more. I
Yeah,
mean, yeah,
it could
it
be a
could be
lot more.
more. And
Obviously,
this,
I'm
and
just
the
plucking
state,
figures out of the air, but yeah.
yeah, and the states aren't supposed to do this, but they'll share information with each other too. And
Hmm.
they'll say, hey, I see, we did this audit, got these transactions, look like they crossed economic nexus in your state. Here you go. And they'll sort of trade them like Pokemon cards and uh, get brownie points with each other. Um, the the risk here, if you're, it's such a frustrating situation because I wish you could ignore it and you didn't have to deal with it. But if you're creating a substantial business, it's something that you need to address because it's more than just audit risk. What we also see very frequently is in the event of selling the business. If you sell the business to another owner, someone else, right? They're going to typically look at the historical sales tax liabilities when they're doing the review and the analysis of the valuation of your company. And if there's substantial sales tax liabilities, or really any sales tax liabilities, they will take that amount, multiply it up, make it larger than it needs to be, and then take that amount off the valuation. So frequently we'll be pulled in to try to clean up some of the sales tax liabilities so that uh, they're all buttoned up before the sale of the business. So that's another reason why it's just better to get your U.S. sales tax cleaned up as much as you can.
That's a very good point, actually. I think that's a very, very sensible because the interesting thing about risk is it's different in different scenarios. So if you're going to just run it for cash flow forever is one thing, but yes, if you are trying to prepare a business to sale, famously, and again, it goes slightly outside the remit of what you're saying, but it's not really. Everything has to be put together in a strategic way, in my opinion. So, talking to experts in selling FBA-based businesses specifically, there's still a market for it, but the market for businesses up to say 500,000 or $1 million value. Which is pretty substantial because it's maybe 2 to 3 times profit. So you can say it's going to be doing several $1 million in revenue already. Um, is quite different from the market for businesses worth several $1 million upwards, where they are normally the former businesses, the latter businesses, who we say the bigger ones, tend to be bought by less risk averse guys. They're super sharp,
Exactly.
so they're going to negotiate the
Exactly.
hell out of you if you have a sales tax liability. They'll be one of the first things they'll look at. Any form of liability, like a lifetime guarantee, which everyone's just been going on about forever, is a great sales tactic. It's a lousy legal tactic because an indefinite ongoing liability is
Indefinite
something that's going to
liability.
kill you when you come to sell it. So do
Yeah,
not do this,
totally.
folks. Put a 3 year limit on it, whatever you like, but put a limit on it. Anyway, but really much more damaging if you're selling to a former docs or a former CEO, a retired lawyer. They're sort of people that want to get an Amazon business on their hands. If it's a lower valuation business, quite commonly they will buy it and run it themselves as a sort of retirement project or a semi sort of semi passive income, a bit like you might buy a property portfolio and manage it. Those guys are going to be much more risk averse, from what I understand, for the guys who've done a lot of selling of these business. And if there is some kind of, especially if you're dealing with a retired lawyer, for goodness sake, or a retired accountant, the first time you
Yeah.
mention unlimited and unknown liability, they're just going to run into the hills. They're not even going to bother to stick around to bother to negotiate a lot of the time because they are risk averse type buyers. They're kind of retail buyers as opposed to really commercially minded, right? So you've just
Yeah.
raised an extremely important point that I think, again, I'm not giving any advice. God knows I am not giving sales tax advice to anyone, but I think what you've raised is just a really critical point, which I love because it ties in with the philosophy that I want to get across in the 10K collective, which is forget about this tactical nonsense. It's not about tactics this year. It's about how does this all fit together into a bigger picture. And if you have an
Yeah. And the
objective of
larger
selling
vision
your
for your life. Yeah,
exactly,
exactly.
yeah, exactly. If you're a person that's totally risk on and you're not bothered about selling your business, then you might make a completely different decision from somebody who wants to be able to sleep at night, or they're going to
Totally.
sell a business in 2 or 3 years' time that's maybe going to be worth a few $100,000. They're going to be
And it's
doing a
totally
retail type
personal
sale.
too.
It
It's
is,
totally
yeah.
personal too. I'll give you two very short examples.
Mm,
I've got one client, he's doing less than $1 million a year in sales.
mm,
He is totally paranoid out the wazoo about audits, and he wants to make sure every single thing is buttoned up exactly, right?
mm-hmm,
And he's planning on selling his business someday. So
mm-hmm,
he had Nexus in like 38 states. He got permits in all of them. His
mm.
liabilities were rather small in many of the states, but he said, I don't care. I need to do everything correctly because I'm thinking about getting some serious financing for this business. A year went by. He applied for some like federal loans from the Small Business Commission, I think is what it's called in the United States. They looked at his sales tax and wanted to make sure that he was all buttoned up on the financial side. And he said, I'm so glad that I did that, right? On the flip side, I've got another client. She is based in, she travels all over the world. I'm not even sure where she is right now, Bali or, Switzerland. I don't know. But she has substantial sales tax liability. She's doing over, I think she's like over 2 million per year. And she has Nexus in like 30 to 40 states. She only got permits in, I think, 3 states, right? And we bring this up to her and I say, hey, you've got these substantial liabilities. Are you sure this is what you want to do? And she's like, screw them. They can try to find me, catch me if you can. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna do what I want to do. And that just shows you the stark contrast between the temperaments of the business owners. And what I say, it's not my place to judge, right? If you understand the risks, you know the liabilities you're carrying, if that's how you want to run your business, then you should. It's totally like how you spend your money, how you run your business is totally personal and differs from individual to individual.
Absolutely. But I mean, I really hope that today we've given people the tools to go and make some accurate assessments of risk and then make their own decisions out based on their own thinking. And again, that's really what I want this podcast to be all about. And you've really helped that mission. So to think the bigger picture, but the details matter, but they matter within your own risk profile, within your own business aims. And you need to go in informed, but there's no cookie cutter responses to this. And you've been very forthcoming about that. It's not cookie cutter stuff, but you've been very you've wended your way between the rock and the hard place, the whirlpool and Charybdis, whatever it is in Greek mythology. Because if you generalize too much, it's basically actionable and not legal. And if you're too detailed, you're just going to everyone's going to go and hide on a rock because it'll be
You get
15-hour podcast.
paralyzed. Yeah,
Yeah, so
totally.
I think you've done a lovely job for us. Thank you so much, Alex. So just to mention that, folks, if I'll put some links on for ongoing links to outgoing links to Alex's site, so that if you want to get that help that I mentioned with the free tools, we'll just go to amazingfba.com/taxvalet, VALET for valet. Alex, any parting thoughts on this complex topic for us?
Just take action. At least know what your liabilities are. Don't ignore the problem. It'll take you an hour or two, and you'll be glad that you did it. What you know can save you a fortune later on down the road.
Great advice. Can't top that. Alex, thank you so much for coming on.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you.